What if I told you that in 2007, two Cunard ships brought the city of Sydney to a standstill? Would you believe me? It sounds a little bit far-fetched, but it actually happened. And if you lived in or were visiting Sydney on the 20th of February 2007, it's a day that you most certainly will have not forgotten. It was remarkable. So let's have a look at the day that Cunard broke Sydney. In 2007, something interesting happened. Cunard sent two of their queens on world cruises, and both arrived in Sydney on the same day. Now, this made for a remarkable event that brought the city of Sydney to a standstill. But first, a little bit of context. Sydney has a long history with the Cunard queens. In fact, it dates back to World War II. And in World War II, both Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, the two original Cunard queens, were sent to Sydney for their wartime service. Queen Mary was actually given a refurbishment in Sydney Harbour to convert her into a troop ship undertaken at the Cockatoo Dry Docks, and Queen Elizabeth was given a refit in Singapore but was also sent to Sydney to bring on board troops and to take them on the convoy service to the Middle East. Now, this created a lot of attention back in the 1940s, and the two ships had this unique moment where they rendezvoused as Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth were coming and going from the harbour, which created a great deal of interest with locals in Australia. Having these two giant transatlantic liners in Sydney Harbour was quite a spectacle. Fast forward to 2007, and two Cunard queens had not been in Sydney Harbour together since World War II. QE2 had visited regularly during her world cruises and had often rendezvoused with the smaller Saga Fjord whilst the two ships were on their respective world voyages. But it never had been a case since World War II that two Cunard queens had been together in the harbour city. In the lead up to that unique day, Cunard and the city of Sydney had been working together to promote the event. Billed as the first time you'd see two Cunard queens together in the harbour since World War II, and had gained a lot of interest with the public, lots of newspapers reporting that this event was going to happen. So there was great general awareness. It also coincided with Queen Mary II's maiden visit to Sydney, so there was already an elevated level of excitement. And for QE2, this would become her penultimate visit to the city, although at the time, no one knew that the ship would soon be retired. However, QE2 was ridiculously famous at this time, and everybody basically knew what the QE2 was. She'd been visiting Sydney since the 1970s, and everyone in the harbour was very aware of the ship and her profile. So already it was an event that was likely to have quite a lot of interest. But no one could really make out just how much interest that there was going to be. Queen Mary II sailed into the harbour that morning, and it was her maiden visit to the harbour. She was on her first world cruise, and I was very fortunate to be there on board the ship, standing under the bridge of the ship as she made her way into the harbour. She was under the command of Commodore Christopher Rind, and she sailed in, did a circular around Fort Denison, and then docked at the naval base in Woolloomooloo. She stayed there for the day, and people were out on boats and walking around to Mrs. Macquarie's chair to have a look at the ship as she towered above the naval base. And she was docked a little bit out of the way, so it wasn't quite as prominent as her current location when she visits in Circular Quay. But there was great interest on the harbour, and as the day progressed, more and more crowds started to line the banks of the harbour. By the late afternoon, things were getting very crowded, and there was a great atmosphere building up around the harbour. I had been able to leave Queen Mary II and found a position to watch what was going to happen next from the Sydney Opera House. What a remarkable place to see such an amazing event. And the big event in question was that QE2 was due to arrive and sail past the Queen Mary II. So QE2 made an uncharacteristically late afternoon arrival. This has all been orchestrated. Usually the ship would arrive in the morning, but they brought her in the afternoon, and she sailed past Queen Mary II. And as Queen Elizabeth II was making her way into the harbour, coming around through the heads and then into sight, something remarkable happened. People started appearing out of nowhere. There were hundreds and thousands of people swarming into the harbour from the city itself. People were leaving their office buildings, people had come in on the train, people were taking the ferries in to see this royal rendezvous, this remarkable moment in history. And so the banks of the harbour became incredibly crowded. There were people everywhere cheering, lots of people trying to get photographs, there was helicopters overhead, and hundreds of boats throughout the harbour, and people on chartered ferries and on the regular Sydney ferry service as well. So it was a remarkable thing to see this harbour just flooded with boats as the QE2 made her way in. She rendezvoused past Queen Mary 2 and the two ships exchanged whistle blasts, and there was huge cheers from the crowd. I only wish that video recording had been as good back then, because to try and capture that moment would have been remarkable. But the two ships, they were seen together. It was a momentous occasion, and then QE2 made her way towards Circular Quay to berth at the overseas passenger terminal. As she did, the boats came in behind her and completely blocked the harbour, which meant that the Sydney ferry service, which many people rely on to get home from work, could not operate effectively. And so we had this remarkable experience where you've got the two ships, hundreds of thousands of people lining the banks. In fact, some estimates put it upwards of 1 million people that came out to see the two ships in the harbour, and people who were just trying to get home from work couldn't do so because the ferries couldn't operate because the harbour was so crowded. At the same time, as the ships had now docked, the QE2 had docked, and Queen Mary 2 was obviously still stationary, people started to want to leave to go home. And the flood of people to the trains and to the taxis and to the cars meant that the whole city ended into a gridlock. And remarkably, people were unable to get home for upwards of hours due to the traffic jams and the delays on the trains. Now, at the time, I was working for a company that was based in Sydney. A lot of my colleagues knew that I had a passion for maritime history, and these two ships were ships that meant a lot to me. And I was getting text messages on my old Nokia phone saying, "I can't get home because of your ships blocking the harbour." So it really was something that I think most people who lived in Sydney, who were there at the time, will never ever forget. That evening, late after the sun had gone down, Queen Mary 2 departed, and she was going to continue her world cruise, and there was a spectacular fireworks display that was put on with the two ships in the harbour together. The following day, QE2 was alongside, and the water taxis that had been doing tours of both ships throughout that particular event, taking people on special tours to have a look at the two vessels, they were doing tours of QE2, and they had this sign which I'm going to share with you on the screen now. And although QM2 is a beautiful ship, and she's a very big ship, this sign with the big one's gone but the pretty one remains always makes me smile, because QE2 was just so picture perfect in her profile. What a beautiful ship she was. This event was repeated the following year when QE2 made her last ever visit to Sydney. This time she rendezvoused with Queen Victoria, and it had very big crowds, but nothing quite like what we'd seen in 2007. And of course, Cunard has done many royal rendezvous since. So that is the true story of how Cunard broke Sydney. It is an interesting little moment in history, one that many of you may remember, but for those of you who weren't there, maybe have forgotten, or perhaps weren't even alive in 2007, this was a moment in time where people en masse gathered to celebrate two remarkable ocean liners and the heritage they continued thanks to Cunard's service in World War II. I hope you enjoyed this little step back in memory lane, and until next time, I hope to see you on board.